The fluorescent lights of the Value Mart hummed a tired, buzzing him over aisles of processed foods and brightly packaged despair. Clara felt the sound in her teeth. It was a noise that belonged to the end of the month, to the stretching of the last few dollars until they were translucent. Her daughter, 5-year-old Lily, sat in the child's seat of the squeaky shopping cart, humming her own tune, a happy little counterpoint to the store's weary drone. She was swinging her legs, kicking the metal basket with a soft, rhythmic thud. Clara ran a hand over her daughter's dandelion fluff hair, the simple touch of balm against the anxiety tightening her chest. In her hand, she clutched a small, crumpled list and a fistful of bills and coins. $17.42. She had counted it 3 times at home and once more in the car. The number hadn't changed. It was an immovable fact, a wall she had to build a week's worth of meals around. Bread, milk, eggs, pasta, a jar of sauce, maybe a small bag of apples if the price was right. Luxuries like meat or Lily's favorite yogurt drinks were planets away, orbiting a sun of someone else's prosperity. She navigated the cart toward the checkout, the items inside chosen with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. Each one had been weighed, its price per ounce calculated in her head. She avoided the gaze of other shoppers, their carts overflowing with casual abundance. She felt a familiar, hot prickle of shame, an emotion she fought daily. It was baseless, she knew. She worked hard, cleaning houses for people who had carts like that. But logic was a poor shield against the judgment, real or imagined, that hung in the air. The line was short. A young woman ahead of her paid with a tap of her phone, grabbing her small bag of organic kale and kombucha before breezing out. Then it was Clara's turn. The cashier, a teenager named Chloe according to her name tag, had the bored, vacant look of someone counting the seconds until their shift ended. "Hi," Clara said, her voice smaller than she intended. She began placing her items on the conveyor belt, each one a small prayer. Bread, eggs, milk, pasta, sauce, the apples which she'd found on sale. Please be enough. Please. Chloe's hands were a blur, swiping and sending the items down the ramp. Beep, beep, beep. The numbers on the small screen climbed with terrifying speed. Lily had stopped humming and was now watching the process with wide, serious eyes. The final beep was followed by a total. $17.68, Chloe announced, her voice flat. Clara's heart sank. A deficit of 26 cents. A canyon. Her face flushed. She had miscalculated. Maybe the tax, maybe the price on the apples was wrong. She fumbled in her purse, a worn leather thing her husband, David, had given her years ago. She searched the corners, the small zippered pockets, hoping for a stray quarter, a dime. Nothing but lint and old receipts. She began, the word catching in her throat. I think I need to put something back. The apples, maybe. Chloe sighed, a gust of teenage impatience. She rolled her eyes, a gesture that felt like a physical blow. Behind Clara, a man in a business suit cleared his throat, shifting his weight and checking his watch. The pressure was immense, a physical weight pressing down on her. Just the apples? Chloe asked, her fingers already hovering over the void button. Before Clara could answer, a new voice cut through the air, thick with cheap cologne and malice. Can't afford an apple? What a shame. Clara turned. 2 men had moved up behind the businessman, their presence instantly sucking the air out of the space. They were dressed in baggy jeans and hoodies, their faces etched with the kind of sneering arrogance that comes from preying on the weak. The one who had spoken, a lanky man with a thin, cruel mouth, grinned at her. His friend, shorter but broader, chuckled, a low, guttural sound. They were Marco and Vince, local parasites known for their petty cruelties. "Leave her alone," the businessman muttered, though he wouldn't meet their eyes. Marco ignored him, his focus entirely on Clara. He leaned against her cart, making it wobble. Lily shrank back in her seat. "Maybe you should put back the milk, too. Kid looks like she could lose a few pounds." The cruelty was so casual, so unnecessary, it took Clara's breath away. Her first instinct was to shrink, to disappear. to grab Lily and run. But then she felt a different kind of heat rise in her chest, a slow, steady burn that pushed back against the shame. It was David's voice in her head, a low murmur from 1,000 memories. Stand your ground, Clara. Dignity is something they can't take unless you give it to them. She met Marco's gaze. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. This quiet defiance seemed to infuriate him more than any verbal retort could have. His grin tightened. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue. He reached out and flicked the carton of eggs with his finger. Or are you too busy counting your pennies? Vince laughed again. Yeah, maybe we can help. Let's have a donation drive for the poor lady. He made a show of digging in his pocket, pulling out a single penny, and flicking it onto the floor near Clara's feet. It spun with a tinny, mocking rattle. The businessman behind her, seeing the situation escalating, simply abandoned his place in line, wheeling his cart to another checkout and keeping his head down. Chloe the cashier was frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The other shoppers in nearby aisles slowed their carts. Their curiosity piqued, but no one moved to intervene. They were statues in a museum of indifference, watching a live exhibit of humiliation. Clara's world narrowed to the sneering face in front of her, the sound of her daughter's ragged breathing, and the cold, hard floor where the penny lay. The store's buzzing hymn had been replaced by a ringing in her ears, the sound of a battle line being drawn, and she was on one side, utterly and completely alone. The thugs, Marco and Vince, fed on the silence of the onlookers. It was a nutrient emboldening their cruelty. Marco's sneer widened as he saw the businessman retreat and the cashier freeze. He was the king of this small, fluorescent kingdom, and Clara was his subject of ridicule. Look at that, Marco said, his voice loud enough for the whole front of the store to hear. She's got nothing to say. Probably forgot how to talk, spending all her time talking to her little brat. He gestured dismissively toward Lily, who had buried her face in Clara's side, her small body trembling. A protective fire, fierce and primal, surged through Clara. She instinctively wrapped an arm around Lily, shielding her. Leave my daughter out of this, she said, her voice low but vibrating with a steel that surprised even herself. Vince stepped forward, crowding her. He smelled of stale cigarettes and something sour. Ooh, she speaks, he mocked. What are you gonna do? Hit us with a loaf of bread? He poked the plastic-wrapped loaf on the conveyor belt, his dirty fingernail leaving an indentation. Clara's mind raced. Calling for security felt useless. The manager was likely a timid man who would be just as intimidated as the cashier. The police would take too long, and what would they do? The men hadn't technically assaulted her. They were masters of a specific kind of violence, the kind that leaves no bruises on the skin, only on the soul. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts of humiliation. Marco's eyes fell on her worn purse, the one David had bought her for their 2nd anniversary. It was simple, unadorned leather, but it was one of her most treasured possessions. He reached out and snatched it from her shoulder before she could react. Hey! Clara gasped, reaching for it. Let's see what we've got in here, Marco said, holding it out of her reach. He unzipped it and tipped it upside down. The meager contents spilled onto the floor. A tube of chapstick, a packet of tissues, a few loose crayons, her car keys, and a small, wallet-sized photo in a plastic sleeve. Everything scattered across the dirty linoleum. Lily let out a small sob. The crayons were hers. Not much of a jackpot, is it? Vince jeered, kicking at a red crayon with the toe of his sneaker. The violation was absolute. It wasn't about money. It was about power. They were stripping her bare in front of the world, showing everyone how little she had, how helpless she was. The onlookers watched, a silent chorus of ghosts. Some looked away, their discomfort a weak and useless shield. Others stared, their faces a mixture of pity and a grim, secret relief that it wasn't them. No one moved. No one spoke up. Their collective silence was a form of consent, a green light for the thugs to continue. Clara didn't scramble for her things. She didn't cry out. A strange calm settled over her, the kind that comes when the worst has already happened. Her gaze was fixed on the small photograph lying face down on the floor. It was a picture of David in his army dress uniform, holding a newborn Lily in his arms. He was smiling, his eyes full of a light that had been extinguished 3 years ago in a dusty corner of Afghanistan. That photo was her anchor. It was a reminder of a love that was fierce and a strength that was real. David had faced down dangers she could barely imagine, not with bluster or cruelty, but with quiet courage and a deep-seated sense of duty. He believed in protecting the vulnerable, in standing for what was right, even when you were afraid. He had died for those beliefs. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. They were sitting on the porch of their tiny first apartment, just after he'd enlisted. She had been worried, terrified of the path he had chosen. "What if you're scared?" she had asked him, her voice a whisper. He had taken her hand. "Everyone gets scared, Clara," he'd said, his voice calm and steady. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do when you are. It's about holding your ground. It's about protecting what you love. Your dignity, your family. That's your ground. You don't ever let anyone push you off it." That memory was a fortress. The fluorescent lights of the Value Mart, the sneering faces of the thugs, the cold judgment of the crowd. They all receded. They couldn't touch the part of her that David had built, the part he had left behind for her to keep. She knelt, not in defeat, but with purpose. She ignored the scattered contents of her purse. She ignored the smirking men. Her focus was entirely on her daughter. She gently turned Lily in the cart seat to face her, blocking her view of the men. "Hey, sweet pea," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "It's okay. We're okay." She used her thumb to wipe a tear from Lily's cheek. "Mommy's got you." This act of maternal focus, of creating a safe harbor in the middle of a storm of cruelty, was a form of defiance more powerful than any scream. It declared that her child's well-being was her only priority. It rendered the thugs and their pathetic power play irrelevant. For a moment, she and Lily were in their own world, a bubble of love and resilience that their tormentors could not penetrate. It was a quiet, unshakable act of holding her ground. The pressure in the aisle thickened, becoming a palpable, suffocating force. Marco and Vince, momentarily thrown off by Clara's focused calm, doubled down on their aggression. Her refusal to be broken was a challenge they had to answer. This wasn't just about a laugh anymore. It was about asserting their dominance. "Ignoring us now?" Marco snarled. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Clara and Lily. "Big mistake." He looked at the shopping cart, at the carefully selected items representing a week of survival. With a sudden, violent shove, he tipped the cart over. The crash was explosive in the tense silence of the store. The metal frame clattered loudly against the linoleum. The jar of pasta sauce shattered, sending a spray of red across the floor. The carton of eggs burst open, yellow yolks oozing into a puddle with the spilled milk. The loaf of bread was crushed under the weight of the cart, and the bag of apples rolled in every direction, some coming to rest in the spreading pool of sauce and raw egg. It was a tableau of waste and destruction, a physical manifestation of their spite. Lily screamed, a raw, terrified sound that cut through the store. It wasn't a sob this time, but a genuine cry of fear. The sound shattered the apathy of the onlookers. A few people gasped. A woman put a hand over her mouth. The store manager, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, finally scurried out from his office at the front. "Here now. What's all this?" he said, his voice a reedy, ineffective squeak. He stopped a safe 10 feet away, wringing his hands. Vince turned to him, taking a menacing step forward. "Mind your own business, old man, unless you want to clean this up with your tongue." Mr. Henderson flinched back as if struck. His face went pale. He looked from the two thugs to Clara, who was now on her knees in the middle of the wreckage, and then to the silent crowd. He saw no allies, no support. He was a man of inventory sheets and profit margins, not confrontations. He swallowed hard, his courage deserting him completely. "I'm calling security," he stammered, before retreating quickly toward his office, effectively abandoning the field. The message to everyone watching was clear. You are on your own. The system would not protect them. The rules of civilized society had been suspended in aisle 3. Fear was a contagion, and it spread rapidly. Shoppers who had been inching closer now pulled back, pushing their carts toward other parts of the store, their faces averted. They didn't want to see. They didn't want to be next. Their silence was no longer passive. It was a deliberate act of self-preservation. Clara remained on the floor, the world a chaotic mess around her. The smell of shattered pickles and tomato sauce filled her nostrils. The sight of the crushed bread, the wasted milk, the precious eggs destroyed, was a punch to the gut. That wasn't just food. It was time she had spent cleaning someone else's house. It was her aching back. It was a promise of a meal for her daughter. Marco laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. "Look at that. A real mess. Just like your life, huh?" He bent down and picked up the small, framed photo of David and Lily. He held it up, squinting. "Who's this? Your hero? Looks like he kicked the bucket. Guess he couldn't protect you either." He was about to say more, but then he saw the few dollars that had also fallen from her purse, now lying in the spreading puddle of milk. With a deliberate, grinding motion, he stepped on the bills, twisting his foot to smear them into the grime. It was the final, definitive act of degradation. He wasn't just destroying her food. He was soiling the very means of her survival. The pressure should have crushed her. The isolation was total. The humiliation was complete. But as Clara looked at the ruin of her groceries and the desecration of her money, something inside her shifted. The fear and shame burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. She was still on her knees, but she was no longer cowering. She was a soldier in her own war, holding the last defensive line. Instead of reacting to Marco or the money, Clara performed the most unexpected action of all. She ignored the thugs completely. She ignored the spilled food and the ruined money. Her entire being was focused on one thing. She reached through the wreckage, her hands steady, and picked up a single unbroken item. It was a small juice box, Lily's favorite apple flavor, that had rolled away from the main spill. She held it in her hand. It was the only thing she had managed to salvage. Then she looked directly at Chloe, the cashier, who was watching, pale and trembling, from behind her register. Clara's gaze was clear and direct. It held no anger, no pleading. It held only a simple, profound dignity. "I'd just like to buy this, please," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "It's 49 cents. In that moment, she wasn't a victim. She was a mother, provider. In the face of utter humiliation, her selfless act was to secure one small comfort for her child. She was taking a bullet, not a real one, but a symbolic one aimed at her pride, and she was doing it with a grace that was breathtaking. She was showing them all, the thugs, the silent onlookers, the world, what truly mattered. She was holding her ground. The quiet, resolute words, "I'd just like to buy this, please," hung in the air. They were a pebble tossed into a still, stagnant pond, and the ripples began to spread immediately. The act was so unexpected, so contrary to the narrative of victimhood the thugs had been writing, that it momentarily stunned them into silence. They had expected tears, pleading, or fury. They had not expected this profound, soul-deep dignity. An elderly man standing near the pharmacy section, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, had been watching the entire exchange with a grim set to his jaw. He had seen fear and cruelty before in jungles half a world away. But he had also seen this quiet, unbreakable strength. He saw Clara on her knees, not in submission, but as if in prayer, her entire world narrowed to the small act of love for her child. He slowly, deliberately, took a step forward, his posture shifting from passive observer to silent witness. He didn't speak, but his eyes, fixed on the thugs, were chips of ice. A few aisles over, a teenage girl who had instinctively pulled out her phone to record the drama suddenly felt a hot flush of shame. She had been thinking of clicks of viral content. Now she saw a woman being stripped of her dignity and a little girl crying, and the woman's only response was to care for her child. The girl lowered her phone, the screen going dark. She looked at her own cart, filled with brand-name snacks and sodas, and felt a profound sense of unease. Her friend whispered, "Are you getting this?" And she just shook her head, her throat tight. The whispers started then, quiet but spreading like wildfire. "Did you see that? They knocked over all her food. She just wants to buy a juice box for her kid. Those guys are animals. Why isn't anyone doing anything?" The question hung in the air, a collective accusation. The silent consensus was breaking. The onlookers were no longer a homogeneous mass of indifference. They were becoming individuals, and those individuals were feeling the weight of their own inaction. The emotional temperature of the store was changing. The cold pity was warming into a slow-burning anger. The fear was still there, but it was now mingled with guilt and a dawning sense of shared responsibility. Chloe, the cashier, was galvanized. Clara's direct, dignified request had pierced her teenage apathy. She looked at the two thugs, then at the mess on the floor, and then at Clara holding the small juice box like it was the most important thing in the world. For the first time all day, Chloe saw a person, not just another customer. She saw a mother. Taking a deep breath, Chloe nodded at Clara. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. She reached for the juice box, her hand extending over the counter in a small gesture of solidarity. This small act of cooperation seemed to snap Marco out of his stupor. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her have this tiny victory. "I don't think so," he sneered, stepping between Clara and the register. He snatched the juice box from her hand and, with a final act of pointless malice, squeezed it hard. The juice erupted from the straw hole, spraying onto Clara's shirt and the floor. He then threw the empty container onto the heap of ruined groceries. "There. Now you have nothing." But it was too late. The shift had already happened. His final act of cruelty didn't read as powerful. It read as desperate. He had lost control of the narrative. The onlookers weren't just watching anymore. They were judging, and the verdict was in. It was at that exact moment that a new sound began to intrude from outside. At first, it was a low, distant rumble, barely perceptible beneath the hum of the store's refrigerators. It was a sound that vibrated in the soles of your feet before you heard it with your ears. It grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't the sound of a car or a truck. It was the synchronized, thunderous roar of multiple heavy displacement engines. Heads turned toward the front windows of the Value Mart. The sound grew louder and louder, a rolling wave of auditory dominance that rattled the plate glass windows. It was the sound of a storm arriving on a clear day. The rumble resolved into the distinct, staggered potato-potato-potato rhythm of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Not one or two, a lot of them. The sound was so overwhelming that it silenced everything inside the store. The whispers stopped. The music was drowned out. Even Marco and Vince looked up, their sneers replaced by expressions of confusion and annoyance. Then, the bikes began pulling into the parking lot, one after another, a chrome and steel river of them. They filled the rows closest to the entrance, their headlights cutting through the afternoon sun. 5 bikes, 10, 15, 20. They kept coming, a seemingly endless procession of choppers and cruisers, their riders clad in worn leather and denim. They moved with a practiced, intimidating precision, parking in a formidable phalanx that effectively blockaded the front of the store. The sound of 24 engines idling in unison was a promise of impending judgment. The ground itself seemed to tremble. The automatic doors of the Value Mart hissed open, and the bikers began to enter. They didn't rush. They walked in with a slow, deliberate swagger that spoke of absolute confidence. They were big men, most of them, with beards and tattoos and faces that looked like they'd been carved from granite and marinated in whiskey. On their backs, they all wore the same leather vest, the same cute, and on every vest was the same iconic, terrifying patch. the winged death's head of the Hell's Angels. The store fell into a deep, profound silence. The air crackled. This was no longer about spilled groceries. A far greater, more primal power had just entered the equation. The bikers fanned out just inside the entrance, their eyes scanning the store, taking in the scene with a predatory calm. Their leader, a mountain of a man with a long gray beard braided into two thick plaits, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the frightened cashier, the cowering manager peeking from his office, the stunned onlookers, the two thugs, and finally, settled on Clara, still on her knees in the middle of the mess. The king of the fluorescent kingdom had just been deposed. A whole new court had arrived. The leader of the biker chapter, a man whose road name was Roadkill, a moniker earned not for what he hit, but for his uncanny ability to survive things that should have killed him, took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. His gaze was like a physical weight, and under it, Marco and Vince shifted uncomfortably. Their cheap bravado evaporated like mist in a desert sun. They were predators of the shallow end of the pool. A great white shark had just entered the water. Roadkill's eyes moved from the two thugs, cataloging their smirking faces and weak-willed cruelty, to the mess on the floor. He saw the shattered glass, the pools of milk and egg, the crushed bread. He saw the single, soiled penny. He saw waste and malice. Then his eyes landed on Clara. She was still on her knees, shielding her daughter, her face a mask of weary resilience. She wasn't looking at him or his men. She was looking at the small, wallet-sized photograph that Marco had dropped, which now lay perilously close to the spreading puddle of red sauce. Slowly, with a grace that was startling in a man his size, Roadkill walked forward. The sound of his heavy boots on the linoleum was the only sound in the cavernous store. He didn't look at Marco or Vince. He walked right past them as if they were insignificant statues. He stopped just before the mess and crouched down, his knees cracking like distant gunshots. His men watched, silent and still. They were a wall of leather and muscle at his back. They trusted his judgment implicitly. If he was taking an interest, there was a reason. Roadkill reached out a large, calloused hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he picked up the small, plastic-sleeved photograph. He brought it closer to his face, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. He saw the image of a young soldier in his dress uniform, his smile bright and proud. He saw the baby in the soldier's arms, her tiny hand clutching his finger. But it wasn't the faces that held his attention. It was the small patch on the soldier's sleeve, the unit insignia, a lightning bolt superimposed over a sword. 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. A flicker of recognition, then something deeper, passed through Roadkill's eyes. He knew that patch. He knew the men who wore it. They were a different kind of brotherhood from his own, but a brotherhood nonetheless, forged in the same fires of risk and sacrifice. The unspoken code was universal. You looked after your own, and you looked after their families. He looked from the smiling man in the photo to the woman on the floor. He saw the resemblance in the shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. He looked at the little girl, now a few years older, peeking out from behind her mother's arm. The pieces clicked into place with an audible snap. He rose to his full, intimidating height and turned, not to Clara, but to his men. He held up the photograph for them to see. "David Doc Riley," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried to every corner of the silent store. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. Several of the other bikers leaned in, their expressions shifting from detached menace to sharp, focused interest. One of them, a man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, nodded slowly. "I remember that name. Kandahar. Pulled 3 guys out of a hot LZ under fire. Took a round to the leg and kept going." Roadkill nodded, his eyes still locked on his men. "He served with Ghost's cousin," he continued, referring to another member of their chapter. "Ghost's cousin didn't make it back from that tour. Doc Riley was the one who carried his letter home to his family." The story settled over the crowd, bikers and shoppers alike. The truth was now laid bare. This wasn't just some random, struggling woman. This was a Gold Star wife, the widow of a hero, a man who had made the ultimate sacrifice, a man connected by a web of honor and memory to the very men now standing in the aisle. Roadkill turned his gaze back to Marco and Vince. The air around the two thugs grew 10 degrees colder. There was no anger in his expression, no overt threat. There was something far worse, a profound and icy contempt. He looked at them the way a man might look at a cockroach he was about to step on. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," he said, his voice quiet, yet every single person in the store heard it as a shout. He took a step toward them. Marco, trying to regain a shred of his former bravado, puffed out his chest. "We didn't do nothin'," he blustered, his voice cracking. "She's the one who couldn't pay." Roadkill didn't even blink. He simply held up the photograph of David Riley. "This man gave everything," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, moral authority. "So his family could live in a country where pieces of trash like you have the freedom to stand here and disrespect his memory." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "That freedom ends now." He turned to Clara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He held the photo out to her. "Ma'am," he said, the word infused with a respect she hadn't been shown all day. "I believe this is yours." Clara finally looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, fragile hope. She took the photo, her fingers brushing his. For the first time since the ordeal began, a tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of gratitude. Someone saw her. Someone understood. Her silent, lonely battle was over. Reinforcements had arrived. The justice that followed was not swift or brutal. It was slow, methodical, and deeply symbolic. Roadkill did not raise a hand to the two thugs. That would have been too easy, too crude. The punishment he had in mind was far more fitting. A lesson in humility and respect, delivered publicly. He gestured with his chin toward the mess on the floor. "Clean it up," he said to Marco and Vince. His voice was flat, leaving no room for negotiation. Vince scoffed. "You gotta be kidding me. We ain't janitors." Before he finished the sentence, two of the largest bikers had moved to flank him and Marco. They didn't touch them. They just stood there, their massive arms crossed, their presence an overwhelming promise of pain. The air grew thick and heavy. Marco, the smarter of the two, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Clean it up," he squeaked. "Every last piece," Roadkill confirmed. "The glass, the eggs. You will use your hands. And then you will get on your knees and wipe the floor clean with paper towels." He pointed to the dispenser near the registers. "When it's spotless, you will apologize to the lady." Under the silent, immovable gaze of a dozen bikers, Marco and Vince's defiance crumbled into dust. With trembling hands, they began. They picked up the large shards of the broken sauce jar. They gingerly gathered the crushed, slimy eggs. Their expensive sneakers were stained with milk and tomato sauce. The onlookers, no longer afraid, now watched with a cold, satisfying sense of vindication. Mr. Henderson, the manager, emerged from his office and handed the thugs a roll of paper towels and a trash bag, his earlier timidity replaced by a newfound, vicarious courage. While the two thugs were occupied with their humiliating task, Roadkill turned his attention to Clara. She had gotten to her feet, holding Lily's hand tightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, "we'd like to replace your groceries." "Oh, no, you don't have to do that," Clara started, overwhelmed. "You've already done more than enough." "It's not a request," Roadkill said gently but firmly. He turned and nodded to his men. "Get her a new cart. Fill it up." What happened next was a ceremony of overwhelming generosity. A biker procured a new cart. Another one gently took Clara's small, crumpled list from her hand. But they didn't just stick to the list. They began to walk the aisles, an intimidating pack of leather-clad shoppers, and filled the cart to overflowing. They didn't grab the cheap store brands Clara had chosen. They grabbed the best of everything. They piled in thick-cut steaks, organic chicken, and fresh salmon. They added bags of gourmet coffee, expensive cheeses, and artisanal bread. They grabbed fresh fruit and vegetables of every color. For Lily, they added cartons of her favorite yogurt drinks, boxes of fun-shaped mac and cheese, cookies, and a large, plush teddy bear from the seasonal aisle. The cart was a mountain of abundance, a stark contrast to the meager items Clara had chosen for herself. It was more food than she'd had in her house in years. Shoppers watched, their mouths agape, as the bikers continued to add more, each item a symbol of their respect and protection. When the cart was finally, impossibly, full, they escorted Clara to the checkout. Chloe, the cashier, was waiting, her eyes shining. Roadkill bypassed the line and guided the cart to her register. "Ring it all up," he said. Chloe began scanning the items, the beep of the scanner now a cheerful, triumphant sound. The total climbed higher and higher, past $100, then $200, then $300. When the final item was scanned, the total was staggering. Roadkill didn't even look at the number. He reached into his vest and pulled out a thick roll of cash, peeling off several $100 bills and placing them on the counter. "Keep the change," he told Chloe. "And for the lady," he added, looking at Mr. Henderson, who was hovering nearby. "For the next year, anything she or her daughter needs in this store is on the chapters tab. You send the bill to us. Do you understand?" Mr. Henderson nodded vigorously, his eyes wide. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." The bikers didn't stop there. One of them, the man with the scar, took off his own kiut, the sacred vest that represented his identity and belonging. He folded it carefully and approached Clara. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion, "we can't replace what you lost, but we want you to know you're not alone. The family of a ranger is family to us." He held out the vest. "This is for your husband's memory." It was the highest honor they could bestow, a symbol that she was now under their protection. Clara, tears streaming down her face, accepted the heavy leather vest, clutching it to her chest. It smelled of leather, road dust, and loyalty, felt like a shield. By the time Marco and Vince had finished cleaning, the floor was spotless. They stood, humiliated and stained, before Roadkill. "Apologize," he commanded. They turned to Clara, their eyes downcast. "Sorry," Marco mumbled. "Louder," a biker growled. "We're sorry," Vince choked out, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and shame. "Good," Roadkill said. "Now get out of here, and if we ever see you in this town again, you won't be walking out." The two thugs practically scrambled over each other in their haste to flee, disappearing out the automatic doors into a well-deserved obscurity. The threat was gone. Respect had been restored. Dignity had been reclaimed. The procession from the checkout to the parking lot was a spectacle of quiet honor. Two bikers pushed the overflowing cart. Roadkill walked beside Clara, who held Lily's hand in one hand and the folded leather vest in the other. The rest of the chapter formed a protective phalanx around them, a moving fortress of loyalty. The other shoppers, the community of onlookers, no longer looked away. They watched with open respect and admiration. Some nodded as Clara passed. The elderly veteran gave a slow, deliberate salute. The teenage girl who had almost filmed the humiliation now watched with tears in her eyes, witnessing a moment of profound, redemptive grace. They reached Clara's car, a decade-old sedan with a dent in the fender and peeling paint. It was a humble vessel, but the bikers treated it like a chariot. They opened the trunk and the doors with a reverence usually reserved for their own chrome machines. They carefully loaded every single grocery bag, arranging them so nothing would tip over or get crushed. One of them, a burly biker with a surprisingly gentle touch, buckled Lily into her car seat, making her giggle as he adjusted the straps. He then pressed the large teddy bear into her arms. Lily hugged it tightly, her face beaming. When the groceries were loaded and the trunk was closed, Clara turned to Roadkill. The words of thanks she tried to form felt small and inadequate for the magnitude of what they had done. They hadn't just bought her groceries. They had given her back a sense of safety and worth that had been eroding for 3 long years since David's death. They had shown her that her husband's sacrifice had not been forgotten, that the honor he lived by still meant something in the world. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, clutching the vest. Roadkill looked down at her, his weathered face softening. "No thanks needed, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Honor demands a debt be paid. David Riley was a man of honor. We're just paying a small part of his tab." He reached out and gently patted the top of Lily's head. "You and the little one, you're under our watch now. You ever need anything at all, you know who to call." He gestured to the vest she was holding. "That patch means your family." Clara got into her car, the scent of leather and generosity filling the small space. She placed the folded vest on the passenger seat beside her, a heavy, tangible symbol of her new reality. As she started the engine, the bikers didn't just get on their bikes and leave. They mounted up and formed two parallel lines, creating a corridor of honor leading out of the parking lot. She put the car in drive and began to pull away. As her car passed between the rows of motorcycles, a sound erupted that shook her to her core. One by one, the bikers twisted the throttles of their Harleys, and the engines roared to life in a deafening, thunderous salute. It was a sound of immense power, of respect, of brotherhood. It was the sound of dragons roaring their approval. It echoed off the storefronts and across the town, a declaration for all to hear. This woman is protected. This family is ours. The community, gathered at the edge of the parking lot, watched in stunned silence. The manager, the cashier, the veteran, the teenager, they all witnessed the final, powerful image. They had seen a woman brought to her knees by cruelty and indifference, and they had seen her lifted up by an unexpected and formidable tribe. The lesson was unforgettable. As Clara drove away from the Value Mart, the roar of the engines followed her, a protective shield against the quiet desperation that had haunted her for so long. A single tear of pure, unadulterated gratitude rolled down her cheek, but this time, she was smiling. Beside her, Lily hugged the giant teddy bear, safe and happy, oblivious to the deeper meaning of the day but secure in its outcome. Clara looked in her rearview mirror. The bikers were pulling out of the lot, a tight formation of dark angels roaring off toward the horizon. Their job done. They had descended upon an ordinary place and transformed it, leaving behind a restored sense of justice and a lingering echo of their power. The final image in her mirror was the setting sun glinting off their chrome, a flash of light before they disappeared, leaving Clara to drive on, no longer a widow struggling in silence, but a woman wrapped in the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a brotherhood she never knew she had. She was no longer alone. She was home,